alcoholic. You guys can hear me? Thank you. I want to thank the group. Thank Ollie. Thank Teresa for inviting me to talk tonight. It's an honor and a privilege to be asked to participate in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a responsibility to give back what was so freely given to me. I was just talking before the meeting. There's a lot of people in AA that feel, they act like they just had lunch with God, and I am not that spiritual. This has been something that I have had to work at. And I'll tell you, I'm going to just bare my soul. I'm 22 years sober. I have not slept a full night since I got sober. That's just the kind of mind that I have. I have almost like, I don't have ADD, but I have a very hyperactive, I just have a very hyperactive mind. So I've had to really discipline myself, especially in 10, 11, and 12. I stood up as a newcomer. A lot of you guys have heard the talk for 17 years. And our beautiful friend Clancy lives 4 blocks from where I live. He just passed away last night. I've known that gentleman for over 40 years. Those guys in that group saw me. I mean, I had so many chips in AA, I could have played poker with them. And the reality of this for me is that until I got around some people that really understood what the problem was for someone like me, the solution didn't work. Fellowship-driven recovery was not enough for me. I had to be taken through this process very, very specifically as it was outlined in the book. And for some reason, this thing happened to me. Like it says in the spiritual experience, at the end of that, if anyone noticed, people ask, how long does it take to go through the steps? And it says right there, what seldom could have been accomplished by years of self-discipline often occurs in a few short months. It's very interesting because it's almost like putting a car together, and you learn about all the features of the car, the power windows, the power steering, the sunroof, the climate control, the cruise control. That was what the 4th step was for me. I started to learn these mechanics of what was blocking me from God, from self, and from others. What happened in 10 and 11 was learning how to drive that car at 100 miles an hour and to use all those features on the fly, and then to do this nightly review. And I had gone through institutions also for 17 years. For anybody that's new, I know there's, a lot of advanced recovery on this platform tonight, but the talk is always towards the newcomer. It's always towards the person that's brand new, that's suffering, that's in emotional pain, that can't understand why it's so painful to not drink. And I've heard many people say it, that, when a lot of us, when I don't drink, I suffer. When I do drink, you suffer. When I drink, I feel in control. When a normal person drinks, they feel out of control. Alcohol does something for me that is so powerful that unless I can develop that sense of comfort and ease that I'm seeking from alcohol through this spiritual process, a drunk like me will never stay here. And I started to really become aware of that in my home group. And one of the things my sponsor said to me, he said, how free do you want to be? You want to be free enough to survive alcoholism? Or do you want to be free enough to chase your dreams, free enough to have relationships that work, free enough to learn how to navigate around the drama, free enough to match calamity with serenity, to have a beautiful life? And I remember he said to me, going into this idea of 11, he said, Adam, what do you want from AA? You keep recycling through the rooms every time there's a crisis. And I said, well, I grew up in Malibu. I want a yacht and a Learjet. I live in a very, successful part of the country. And he laughed when I said that, because I thought it was about getting something. And what he said to me, he said, if you work steps 4 through 9 and you consistently learn the discipline of 10, 11, and 12, what you'll get, because I'm a taker, I'm here to get something. He says, what you'll get is a quiet mind and a loving heart. And I remember looking at him and thinking, what do I want that for? Because I had no idea. But what happens is the further I get away from the drink, the more I start to understand a very different kind of unmanageability. And unless I really understand what the problem is, the solution's not going to work. And I'm going to say this again several times. If the problem is alcohol, the solution is abstinence. And the doctor's opinion is very, very clear that some of us are entirely normal in every respect. He says entirely normal, able, friendly people. That's not who I am. I'm that restless type, and that restlessness is an undisciplined spirit. That's what it is. An irritability, a discontentment. And I want to talk a little about that. So what happened is I started coming to meetings drunk. You don't see a lot of drunk people in AA, but I eventually merged with this group of people that took the statements in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and turned them into questions. Dan S. was my original sponsor, very, very short lineage. He was sponsored by Joe Hawk, who was sponsored by Gary Brown, Paul Martin, Paul Stanley, Dr. Bob. It's a very short lineage. And I remember telling Dan Sherman, I said, you know, Dan, I went through residential treatment 28 times. I was really hoping that would get rid of Dan, you know what I mean? Because he was so overzealous and enthusiastic about helping me because we'd grown up together. I had lived in Dan Sherman's family's building as a little boy, and I was abandoned there when my parents were in the middle of a separation. And what happened is Dan eventually, that's where part of the Fellowship of the Spirit and Big Book Awakening started, in that very place. And so Dan thought I was a project. He was picking me up and taking me to meetings drunk, and I was, you know, getting high in his car, and it was just shameful. It was so shameful. But he had said to me, how free do you want to be? And when I told him I'd gone through treatment 28 times, he looked at me and he said, Adam, that doesn't make you an alcoholic. And I thought, you're kidding. He says, no, it just means you paid $500,000 for a big book. And I didn't think that was funny. See, treatment was a great place to fatten me up for another run. Treatment has its rightful place in recovery. Even Bill Wilson had gone through treatment. And I'm saying this for a reason. Some people don't go through treatment, but treatment never solved the problem. And part of the problem for me, if I really don't understand what the problem is, the solution's not going to work. And that became something that I didn't understand. I remember someone saying to me, Adam, if alcohol is your problem, that drink, that shot glass, that 12-pack, if that's your problem, you're probably not an alcoholic. And if you are, in fact, an alcoholic, the type that's described in the doctor's opinion, your problem is an alcohol. And it took me another decade to understand what he was trying to tell me. It was almost like some kind of cruel riddle. I drank over that for years. But what happened to me, and all of this will lead into the 11th step, is I got around a group of people in AA that took the statements in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, turned them into questions, and directed them at me. It was an intrusive, confrontive way of looking at AA. Questions like, was I incapable of being honest with myself? Did I in fact drink because I liked the effect produced by alcohol? Was I restless, irritable, and discontent by nature? Was that my natural state? Was my greatest obsession that somehow, someday I would control and enjoy my drinking? As I started to go through those considerations, for the first time I saw the truth. And the greater truth for me as an alcoholic, the most obvious truth, is that I was never really able to live successfully with alcohol. That was the obvious part. But the greater aspect of alcoholism for me is that I started to discover that I wasn't able to live successfully without alcohol. And what it really meant for me to be an alcoholic, if I stripped all of the outside circumstances away, is that somehow I had a mind that continued to take me back to alcohol. Every time I got released from a treatment center, an emergency room, a hospital, what it really means for me to be an alcoholic is I have this mind that continues to lead me back to booze. It's almost like my default program, like on a computer. And, you know, I come from a mathematical background, a lot of math majors in my family. And, you know, I've sponsored a lot of guys that write programs and build apps for phones. And we talk about the language that Bill Wilson uses in 1939 and how really advanced it was for that time period, because we use the word program today all the time. It's common vernacular. One of the definitions of a program, if you look it up in the dictionary, is a sequential set of instructions that brings about a result. Now listen to the language. What do you do when you get a corrupt file on a computer? It's obvious. You install a recovery disk. And what's its function? It restores the software to an earlier point. That is the second step. It never occurred to me that steps 10 and 11 function very much like a viral scan. They are there to show me promptly how to be rid of the things in myself that are blocking me from God, from self, and from you. And if I do not catch that, like on the fly, in that racing car at 100 miles an hour, If I can't see the selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear, do the corrective measure, discuss it with someone immediately. If I cannot, ask God to remove it at once. What happens is I end up with this review at the end of the day. And not everyone has to do this. But again, going back to this question, how free do you want to be? Do you want a quiet mind? Do you want a loving heart? Do you want this operating system to maximize itself so you can discover what your purpose is? It never occurred to me that 10 is like a program, 11 is a power, and 12 is a purpose. It gives me purpose. And I never saw how powerful this operating system, when superimposed over my emotions. Normal people are intellect over emotion. They think, they process, and they act. People like me, I'm emotion over intellect. I act, process, and then think. Oops, 10th step. I mean, we're the only people that burn bridges ahead of us. And if you don't relate to this, maybe you're not the type that I am. But what happens is I have to have a reversal. I have to have a psychic change. And now my neocortex sits at the top instead of the bottom. The limbic system is no longer running my life. And, you know, the reason, Ollie, I was so apprehensive about talking this is because, like I told you, I cannot describe or define this power we call God. Like the wind, I can show you the results of it. But I would be a fraud if I were to tell you that I could describe it in the terms necessary to win the confidence of somebody else. But I can guarantee you that, like I had said before, Einstein had said it. And I'm going to read, I promised I wouldn't read out of the book. I'm going to read a couple little things. Here's a little piece. It says, here are thousands of men and women, worldly indeed, right, successful, that flatly declare that since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a simple, certain attitude toward that power and to do certain things, which are the steps, okay? There has been a revolutionary change in their living and thinking in the face of collapse and despair. Are you, if you are new, in the face of collapse and despair, in the face of total failure of their human resources? That means puke smells the same in a Mercedes. It means you can be at the gates of insanity and death even without a drink. They found a new power, okay? 11th step, peace, happiness, and sense of direction flowed into them. That's just one part, and I'll simplify it. Einstein said, I would rather live my life pretending there's a God and finding out there isn't than live my life pretending there's no God and finding out there is. So this word sought, to seek, is a verb. I am going to seek God in the hearts of men. That is the hunt. You know, my friend, my new sponsor, and I have a couple spiritual advisors. Charlie is here, and we've talked about the wounds of wealth. And the wounds of wealth, I live at a place called the Rehab Riviera, right? The only people we see at AA now are coming to keep their trust fund. And, you know, the thing is, they don't have a hunt. These kids are so sad. They're so miserable. They're so broken because everything's done for them. They walk out of a $5 hit crack house, and 3 days later, they're complaining because the infinity pool's not warm enough. But what this first piece is, to seek God. I seek God in the hearts of men. And I never understood how powerful this beginning would be in that 11th step, that I come to AA. And I'm going to jump into this right now. There's a lot of judgment in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know I'm going to watch some eyes roll. You hear a guy say, my God is a doorknob, right? And we all start coming up with all this judgment about, how can your God be a doorknob? How is that possible? And one day after all that judgment, I hear Sam Shoemaker's poem, I Stand at the Door. And I am going to butcher this poem, but this is the way it goes. I stand at the door. It's a door that men search for all over the world. It is a door that they look for blindly. And I'm careful not to go too far inside this door, because if I do, I get consumed with what's inside this door. So I stand at the door. I don't go too far outside the door because I get consumed with worldly clamors and I forget what's in the door. So I stand at this door. And it's really interesting because I have a printout of it. Just one of the lines in this door is, it says, men die outside this door as starving beggars die on cold nights in cruel cities in the dead of winter, die for what they want, which is in their grasp. They live on the other side of it. Live because they have not found it. It's so interesting because that door, he says he stands at the door because it's only their hand that can open that door. So he puts their hand on this door, and then he reveals again that it is the door to God. And if you read that poem, what's so fascinating about that is what we're given in AA. We become the ushers of a finger that points to a power, a magnificent way of life, which we can describe it. Oh, I crawled out of a dumpster and now I'm running IBM. We can describe it in a lot of different ways, and we could kind of hang that out there. My experience is not that. My experience is purpose. It's a program. It's love. It's integrity. It's self-respect. It's respect for my family. It's a quiet mind. And it's going to be, as we go along through this process tonight, about having a design for living, a very specific design for living that is outlined here in some very simple instructions. And it's very interesting because I have it written here somewhere, coming out of the 10th step, it says, if we have carefully followed directions. So talking about what's going to happen as I do this nightly review and the Upon Awakening prayer. I've done a lot of work. And if you're new, we all say that, 6 and 7 is only a paragraph because, Bill. The reality is, if you've done the work the way that our home group does it, you're walking into your sponsor's house with like a volume of resentments. You got a bunch of stuff on relationships. You got a list of fears. And you're coming there for a long talk. If you look at the end of chapter 5, it says we've written down a lot. It says we've analyzed our resentments. We begin to understand their futility, their fatality. It's giving me some very specific instructions, and I'm going through those instructions with a new person, because what that's doing is it's starting to set up a foundation of 10 and 11. And, I will tell you this, if you're new, to jump out of this idea, hope doesn't matter to drunks like us until we're hopeless. Hope doesn't matter to a guy like me when I got $500,000 in the bank, brand new sports car in the driveway, a little boat down in the marina. You wouldn't catch me dead in an AA meeting. And if you're new here tonight, God doesn't matter to people like me until my back's against the wall. And I'll tell you, I got shot. I'm not bragging about this, but I was on this gurney and it just missed my heart. And I got the paramedics over me with these paddles, and I'm looking up at them, and I'll tell you, all I know is God. If you've ever been in a place where you're confronted with your mortality, there is two things men cry for: mommy and God. Some people that have had this experience, a couple of my friends that have had heart attacks, man, they're believers. You talk to people that have been right on the edge, and it seems to be that they believe. You know what I mean? It's like that guy that went up. We got a friend that was one of the Apollo space astronauts. Boy, does he believe. You know what I mean? I can't name who he is, but we see all these guys, especially on the West Coast. But what's so fascinating is, when I got my head in that toilet every morning, all I know is God. I mean, who prays more than drunks like us? I mean, if you don't relate, go to Al-Anon. And what happens is I get a couple days away from that last drink, and now you got to write this elaborate chapter called We Agnostics, which I just read out of, to try to prove and establish to me there just might be a power. And one of the most wonderful lines that Chuck C had said, and I was just reading it in Sandy Beach's book that I was given by his daughter, Chuck C had said, the real problem isn't alcohol. The real problem is a conscious separation from God. And then he points to the 11th step, which is the subject of this talk: conscious contact with God. That's the solution. And the bridge from steps 2 to 11 is steps 4 through 9. Maybe what we should say in AA is, rarely have we seen a person fail that's done steps 4 through 9. Rarely have we ever seen anybody do 4 through 9. I do the AA waltz: 1, 2, 3, drink, 1, 2, 3, drink, 1, 2, 3, drink. And I'll do anything but that which will solve this spiritual problem. So I started to understand, as I'm coming through this process, when I'm looking at my resentments, I'm looking at my selfishness, I'm looking at my dishonesty, I'm looking at my fear. And I'm going through this process in a fifth step of admission, acknowledgement, and acceptance. I'm accepting some huge chunks of truth about myself. And in five, it's asking me, the word attitude is very important to understand. This attitude. Attitude is an aeronautic term, like altitude. Attitude means positioning or point of attack. And I didn't understand that this is about a change in perception. So back to this point where I was understanding how close I am to this idea of God when I'm on my deathbed. And then the arrogance that somehow stands between me and that spiritual experience is astonishing. This ego rebuilds itself. Harry Tiebout, who was in the third appendices, the appendices right after the one that we just read, who was a psychiatrist, a board-certified psychiatrist, a friend of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a major contributor to our literature. If you really find out that he was a contributor to some of the literature, Harry Tiebout says the four qualities of an alcoholic are grandiose, sensitive, immature, and omnipotent. And those are our finer qualities. I tell people, stick that in your next Tinder ad. And I start to see what it is that's blocking me. What is it in steps 4 through 9 that are blocking me? It's like when they asked Michelangelo, how did you make the statue of David? Michelangelo said, I never really made the statue of David. I just chipped away everything that wasn't David, and there he was. So just to finish up this foundation, in 1939, the same time as the Big Book was published, the Oxford Group met at the Hollywood Bowl. A lot of us, that's very close to here. One of the ideas the Oxford Group had is the word enthusiasm. It means theos. Enthusiasm means theos. It means God within. And they felt there were 4 things that blocked a human being from God, because we're talking about these things. We're talking about seeking through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God. And I'm going to start to look at what it is that's blocking me. And this is the 4 things they felt blocked a human being from God. 1, a dubious luxury I will not forego. 2, a secret I will not confess. 3, a restitution I will not make. 4, someone I will not forgive. And the idea was that if a human being was unblocked of those 4 things, the light of the Spirit for the agnostics here, or the light of God for those that believe in this power, would shine through them like a beacon. And that's what Ebby Thatcher had. Ebby Thatcher had brought that to Bill Wilson. And when Bill Wilson said the boy was on fire, and he said he was aghast, and he also said that his gin would outlast Ebby's ranting. And then he pauses, and then he said, but there sat in front of me a miracle. Because he knew that Ebby lived like him. Ebby felt like he did. Ebby thought the way he did. Ebby drank the way he did. And that was one of the most powerful moments in my life. My ex-girlfriend had taken me to Bedford Hills, and you get to go to Stepping Stones, and you walk through this museum, which was Bill Wilson's home, and you see the seance room and all these different things, and there's a library, and then you walk into the kitchen, and the guy that runs the museum says, sit down at the table. So you sit down, me and my girl sit down at the table, and he walks the other end of the room, and then he says, oh, by the way, that's the table. And then he shuts up. And all of a sudden he sees the tear coming down the corner of my eye. And he starts laughing hysterically. And he goes, oh, everybody does that. He goes, if you came all the way from Southern California to Bedford Hills, New York, you read the story. You read the story. Because it was like a tide at flood when Wilson says it stretched around him, all around him, that this feeling that God, the presence of God, of something that happened at that moment in that room. And if any of those events didn't happen, all the historical events that led up to that, if Roland hadn't gone to Carl Jung, and we just read it, what we read in the spiritual experience is very much like Carl Jung had said. He said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never, ever seen a single case recover. That's who I was. I went through 28 residential treatment centers. My mom moved and didn't leave a forwarding address. It was a death sentence for Roland Hazard. And then he tells him the solution. He says, ideas attitudes, and emotions that are once the guiding force of these men or women are suddenly cast to one side, and a whole new set of conceptions begins to dominate them. And that is exactly what happens in steps 4 through 9. That suddenly I'm coming to this 10th step now and this 11th step with a platform. I'm coming with some completely new conceptions. I'm on new footing. And it begins by talking about we have entered the world of the spirit. Now, one of my friends, Herb K, says, well, if you've entered the world of the spirit, what do you think you've exited? And then he shuts up and you think, well, I've exited the world of self. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that is the root. I don't think much of myself, but I'm all I ever think about, right? It's not thinking about less of myself, but it's thinking about myself less. So I'm coming into 10 now with this idea. Not everyone has to do this. You know, what's so interesting about Bill Wilson, and this is where I really started to understand these functions. The function of the mind is to think. The function of the body is to act. The function of the human spirit is will, and my will always choose me. The function of the will. Now, what it's asking me to do is to align my will with this power, to take this position that we just read in We Agnostics, to take a certain attitude towards this power, and suddenly, like a fish that's dropped into water, my life works. All of a sudden, all of my life, I was in collision with people, places, and things. I had this delusion that I could arrange life to suit myself. And what's happened as a result of taking these actions that I'm going to start to fortify and develop in 10 and 11 is it's going to manufacture a type of spiritual alignment that I can maintain and develop for the rest of my life. And it's not only going to give me a program, it's going to give me a power, and then it's going to give me a purpose. Praying only for knowledge of his will for me. I was thinking probably the biggest failure of my experience with human beings is a misunderstanding of my will. What is my will? Is my will to push paper for my boss, to drop off mortgage papers, or to pay a mortgage? Or what I started to understand is, what is my primary purpose? To fit myself to be of maximum service to others. And from that, all the other things. One of my good friends in our home group was talking about the purpose of an apple tree. And the purpose of an apple tree is obvious. It makes apples. But there's all kinds of secondary and tertiary purposes of that tree. The tree also provides foliage, it provides shade, it provides food for animals, it provides fertilizer. It has a lot of other purposes, but the primary purpose, my primary purpose, is to fit myself to be of maximum service. And what my sponsor said, because this is one of the pieces in that 11th step, is he said, if you were watching a bunch of kids playing in a playground, and some were on the slide and some were on the swings, and some were on the merry-go-round, would you care what they played on? Absolutely not. You just wouldn't want them extorting each other and embezzling or throwing each other off the ride. So my question is, why would I ask God if he cares if I'm a stockbroker or a plumber? I'm looking at these fundamental internal ideas of love, compassion, support. The very simple idea that I extrapolate through part of the 4-step in the ideal in the relationship inventory was the question, if I had a daughter, what kind of man would I want my daughter to marry? It's so simple. I've taken those diabolical creatures through the steps, 4 or 5 life sentences, and I've known a lot of real interesting people. And they're always the same. You ask them, if you had a daughter, what kind of man would you want your daughter to marry? Loving, compassionate, loyal, considerate, supportive, generous, responsible, steadfast, right? No matter who I've talked to, the fundamental idea of this God is within every man, woman, and child. It's there. It's obscured by something. There's a great story in AA about a little kid. He's out on the beach playing in the beach, and we have this thing called June gloom or May gray, where we get all these clouds on the coast, and this little boy's flying a kite. And this old guy says, what are you doing, son? And he says, well, I'm flying a kite. He says, well, how do you know? You can't see it. I don't see a kite. And he says, yeah, but I feel the pull of it. All of my life, I felt this pull. Not everyone does. In fact, some people, like in We Agnostics, will spend their whole life trying to tell me and you that we don't feel that pull, that sense of what is right, the sense of kindness, of love, of being supportive, of being helpful. But what happened when I started to do this 11th step and this 10th step is it showed me how to be rid of the things in me that were blocking me from that purpose. So I seek through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact by being rid of the things in me that are blocking me. Praying only for knowledge of his will for me. His will for me is to be kind, is to be helpful, it's to be supportive. You know, one of the most evidentiary points in my life was I was standing at an airport and a guy comes running up to me in a slingshot t-shirt covered in tattoos, and he says to me, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I mean, he's accosting me in the airport. This guy looks like he just got out of prison, and I'm thinking, "No, sir, I don't remember you." I'm figuring he's going to hit me up for money. And then he points to these two beautiful girls, these little kids, and this lady that's with them. And then he says it. He said, 15 years ago, you spoke in a prison panel, and something you said changed my life. These are my amazing daughters. This is my beautiful life. We want to thank you. Something you said was so powerful that after 3 terms in prison, 15 years ago, I came out and I started doing recovery, and these are my daughters. Now there's 5 people in this airport hanging, kids are hanging on my feet. The ladies kissing me, and we're all crying in this airport. And I'll tell you something, there's 2 dates in a human being's life: the day they're born, the day they find out why. If you don't believe in life after death, look around AA. I got here the day before I died. That's why it's so powerful for me and some of us. This thing of having that kind of purpose, because I've done everything else. I know how to chase money, property, and prestige. If we talk about purpose, what Alcoholics Anonymous is asking me to do, not only to search for God in the hearts of men, but to live a spiritual life. And what happens is money, property, and prestige will chase me. It's an automatic thing that my table will be full. It is absolutely counterintuitive if you're new, because it looks like it is through sacrifice, but it's not. It is by taking these fundamental actions over a long period of time that the whole world opens up to people like us. God's people. I couldn't understand what that meant, but what it meant is that I follow direction. I'm asking for 3 things in the 11th step: direction, wisdom, and power. These are the 3 things I'm looking for. I am looking for these things. So there's actually 6 prayers. I'm not going to read them all, but what I did is from the 11th step, when we retire at night, the word ask is used, I think, 7 times. 6 of those times, circle the word ask and look at it. It's asking for God's forgiveness. It's asking me for inspiration, for intuition. These are things that happen in the 11th step. I did not understand how powerful these ideas are. There's 3 kinds of prayers. This is what they're, you want to write them down. The first one is contemplative, the second is petitionary, and the third is centering. These are 3 types of prayers that involve meditation. So one of the things that happened to me, and I think this is very important, we all know that when I got out of my 28 treatment site, the guy that was running the detox said, "Come back to detox next week and tell everybody how you managed to stay sober a whole week if you can make it." And he was such a kind of like, he didn't care. So I got this big resentment, and I kept coming back to this detox to help others. But I was tricked into service by doing that. Now, when Bill Wilson got out of Towns Hospital that 3rd time, he gets an idea. Maybe if I go back and help some of the patients, I'll feel better. Now, we all know that Dr. Silkworth was a double board certified physician. He's got a certification in neurology and psychiatry. I don't care where you come from. That's a big deal. Even today, that's a big deal amongst doctors to have those 2 credentials. And, you know, he says to Dr. Silkworth, "Can I come back and talk to some of the patients?" And we all know, I mean, Silkworth's like, "You want to do what?" He said, with some misgiving, we allowed Mr. Wilson to come back into our hospital with no credibility whatsoever and talk to some of the patients. But what he saw from 1935 to 1939, he said, was absolutely amazing. He was so amazed that if you look at that first endorsement where it says you can absolutely rely on anything these men say about themselves, was given as a letter of credibility to Bill Wilson, who had no credibility, right? I mean, he's a stockbroker, if even that. All he really knew was what Ebby had brought to him: surrender, catharsis, restitution, and service. And Bill made that effort. He was so impressed that that endorsement allowed Bill to go into any hospital in the United States where they treated alcoholism. But the reason I bring that up is because restless, irritable, and discontent, what that is the mind, body, and spirit. And I never understood that the center of this is the body. And people will argue, it might come up in the questions today, the mind, the irritability of the mind, the fault-finding mind is 10. The restlessness, right? 11. To center my body. It sits between the mind and the spirit the discontentment. 10, 11 is what are directly related to restless, irritable, and discontent. These remedies will center me. It will help me to contemplate and be rid of what's blocking me, and it will give me purpose. It will solve the discontentment if I follow these very simple spiritual instructions. And if you're new, part of the word spiritual is ritual. It's such a simple idea. How could I have missed it? With a college degree and all my education, I'm standing in a soup line in South Central, like South Chicago, in the snow, freezing to death, because I wasn't humble enough to hear this message. If you're new tonight, I hope you might be humble enough to hear this message of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not my message. When I told my sponsor about that guy at the airport, he goes, "You have a big mouth and a good memory, Adam. It don't mean anything." He says, "You're just the entertainment. Don't let it go to your head." Your primary purpose, that purpose in that 11th step, to be helpful. That's the purpose. And the power to carry that out. So they say, if you can't find the temple in your heart, you will never find your heart in a temple. That's 10. 11 is the power. 12, the glory. The kingdom, the power, and the glory. I'm not going to get into all this stuff, but we talk about where religious people are right. And without going into other literature, like I just did with I Stand at the Door, these things line up very, very succinctly with mind, body, and spirit. The triangle, mind, body, and spirit. My head, my heart, and my feet need to be moving in the same direction. So really, to understand this piece in 11, the centering prayer, the contemplative prayer, where I look and watch for the review. Where was I selfish, dishonest, resentful, and afraid? Do I owe an apology? It's a whole set of questions there. And then upon awakening, like Clancy, our dear friend who just passed, he said, "Adam, never leave a meeting without knowing where another one was, where your next meeting was. The shower I took yesterday won't keep me clean today." That's there's prayers, promises, warnings, and directions. You can take 4 highlighters. I'm not going to go through all that because I was asked not to read out of the book too much tonight, but my whole book is highlighted with four colors: prayers, promises, warnings, and directions. There's a lot of directions in this 11th step. Then there's prayers, there's promises, and there's warnings, all set up here very methodically. If you're new, I would do it every day. I would go for those 4, 5, those actual 6 prayers every day and ask those prayers. Ask God for forgiveness. Ask Him for direction. Ask Him for wisdom. Ask Him for power. And that purpose to help others will present itself in your life. Open for questions.